Hmm. So let me guess, Miss Authoress. Would your favorite book happen to be Red Queen, perhaps? Hello everyone. So today we are going to do a review of Powerless. So I have a lot of mixed thoughts about this book. It was an emotional roller coaster and I'm excited to get into it, so let's jump right in. Okay, so let's start with the basic plot for this book. So we start out with our main character, Peyton, and things are going okay. I mean, not really for her. She's living in the slums and just trying to survive with her best friend. And she is what they call an ordinary, so she does not have powers. And everyone else basically does. So kind of a odd reverse there, where the people without powers are the weird ones. And I saw so many parallels to a certain book, and I will get into that later. But for now, so she is an ordinary. She does not have powers, but basically everyone else does, and there are different powers and levels. I thought the power hierarchy system and different specifications were interesting. Some things were well thought out and then others weren't, but that was just how she wrote it and it was fine. That's not where most of my problems lay. So the thing about this kingdom is ordinaries are basically illegal. They are to be hunted down and killed if any are found because they are seen as a danger to the kingdom. Now our male lead, Kai, is the hunter of the ordinaries. And I expected a lot more from this dynamic than I actually got. It was just a lot different than I expected. So Kai is also the prince of this kingdom, and he has a brother, unfortunately. I had a lot of personal issues with this, and I will get into that also later. Just wait. So per his father's order, Prince Kai goes out to hunt some ordinaries. Then eventually he meets our other protagonist, Peyton, and instead of actually getting our hunter-hunted dynamic and him realizing what she is and trying to track her down and her running for her life and having this great conflict, that doesn't happen. So sorry if you haven't read the book and that's disappointing to you. I wish I'd known beforehand. Though there were still some great scenes in this book, I promise that. I did enjoy half of it maybe. So after these two meet, some crazy stuff happens, and eventually they are both signed up to do what is called the purging trials. And they're notoriously deadly. No one survives them, whatever. They're supposed to be really, really difficult. And the public gets to vote who they want to represent them in the trials. And they pick Peyton. She goes to the palace and participates in these trials. And that is the basic plot. I won't really go into more detail with it until the end with the spoiler section of this video. Now, my opinions on this novel. How do I say this? I don't know. This novel, I don't know how I felt about it. I have so many mixed emotions, and it was just so up and down for me that I just can't even fully process and put into words. But I do have something to say. I've heard a lot of other people think this as well, that this novel had a lot of Red Queen and Hunger Games elements. And I gotta say, about sums it up. Towards the beginning of the book, I saw some parallels, especially with the powers and just the setting and everything, and with the characters too. There were a lot of similarities to Red Queen. And at first, I was okay with it. I was like, okay, sure, I can get on board with this. This is still a good book. But then we got to a point where it was so much like Red Queen that it hurt me. I I've got some opinions about Red Queen. Honestly, I did not finish that series. I read the first book and made it through about half of the second book, and I just gotta tell you, I didn't like it. It started out okay, and then everything just went downhill from there. And I don't know particularly what it was. This isn't supposed to be a Red Queen rant, but I gotta defend myself here. My main problems were first that it was a dystopian, but also a fantasy. And dystopian fantasies are a thing, but this did not do it well, in my opinion. 1 minute, I feel like I'm in this beautiful fantasy world where there's this power and these different dynamics and this whole kingdom and this prince and this king. And then the next, I feel like I've just been thrown into a sci-fi dystopian? What happened? Why are there machine guns now? Why is there an airplane there? What? I didn't like it. It didn't blend well. It really didn't. There was just too much. I kind of got what she was going for, but it just wasn't my preference. I really didn't like how it was handled. I just kind of wanted to shake the author and say, pick one. Is this a dystopian or is this a fantasy? Which one is it? Worse than that was the romance. The love triangle made me want to set things on fire. Oh, I don't even like thinking about it. It was just, no, I did not like that series. I wanted to like that series. I really did. I tried, but no, I couldn't do it after a while. And so I think it's a little unfair because a lot of my PTSD and angst when I think about Red Queen and how many similarities there were in this book, Powerless, I think a lot of my negative feelings just kind of bled into it while I was reading. But there were a lot of things that I found really similar. The powers, for one, very similar, and the characters. One in particular, but I almost felt like she was done worse than in Red Queen, and I had a problem with that. But there were some pros about it. It mostly stayed in the fantasy realm, and I appreciated that. There weren't too many random bleedings of contemporary dystopianness and random technology. I really don't like when that's randomly mixed in and not explained. There can be technology in fantasy worlds, yeah, completely, but it needs to be explained. There can't just be a digital clock on someone's nightstand when nothing else has power. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So you need some good, healthy explanations for things. And I think a lot of YA authors in particular just don't put in details like that. And I'm okay with that to an extent, but not in Red Queen. That was too much. Got lost in all the military jargon and whatnot. It was like reading Shatter Me, but also fantasy. And it didn't work. But back to Powerless, the book we're actually reviewing today. I promise this is not a Red Queen rant, I think. Anyway, so other things I liked. I did like the romance in this one. She did it fairly well. It wasn't what I was expecting from the book, and I was a little miffed about that. I had come in with all these expectations for how it was going to go, because that's what was advertised, and then I was not given it. But regardless, it was still a pretty good romance, and I enjoyed it. I thought there were some pretty good scenes. They just weren't what I had really come into the book expecting. Honestly, I was really grating at the end. I got very, very close a few times to full out dropping the book. I almost didn't finish it. But I knew that I wanted to do a review for it and couldn't do that for a book I had not finished, technically. So I pulled through. And I do recognize that it is kind of sad that was my main motivation rather than actually because I was liking the book. But there were moments that I definitely really enjoyed and I wanted to keep reading, but then they were just overshadowed by some that just weren't well written exactly and felt like a ripoff of Red Queen and or Hunger Games. I do get the Hunger Games because the trials felt very similar to that kind of vibe. And I didn't have particular problems with that, but I also had gone in again with this one expectation of the trials and had received something else. And it wasn't that bad, but I don't know, just could have been better in my opinion. Still, some good scenes in here, and I did like Kai and Peyton's relationship. That did pull me through a lot of moments, honestly. I am a romance junkie. I'm all for the romance, and if it's not done right, it can very easily make me just full out drop something. If it is done well, then you can guarantee I will endure to the end, even if everything else is painful. Maybe. But there was a point when she decided to go for a little love triangle of her own with the two brothers. That nearly sent me over the edge. Because, again, just that PTSD, like the Red Queen, I was shuddering. But the romance was definitely better handled than it was in Red Queen, so I appreciated that. And there was a major twist at the end that actually gives me hope for the next book and makes me think that we might actually get what we were promised in the first book. Again, kind of sad that one of my favorite things was the end, and I was honestly very, very relieved that it was over. Like, that typically seems like a really bad sign when a book is over. You shouldn't be happy that it's over. You should be sad because you want more. And if you're happy, it's because you got the resolve that you wanted and things are okay. That's not why I was happy, because things are not really okay at all. But I was happy about it because now we finally have the setup that I want and I could stop reading the book. Kind of a bad sign for it, honestly. It did have a lot of golden moments, and I'm giving it a really bad rap, really, because I have a lot of pet peeves. Again, because a lot of my anger is directed at Red Queen, and there were a lot of parallels to Red Queen. And that alone kind of frustrated me, because there were certain points when it was so similar that it felt like I was reading the same book. And I have a real problem with that. You need to draw from other creatives, you need to draw from sources outside of your own brain, because sometimes our brain don't brain, we only have a few brain cells, and we need to draw inspiration from things. That is just basic human nature. It's things like Star Wars wouldn't have been inspired if it weren't for Dune or other mass productions that were there in the past, and now Star Wars is inspiration for thousands of other things. It's just natural. But I feel like never should something be so similar to someone else's work that I feel like I'm just basically reading the same thing. There was just too much for me, particularly because I didn't like Red Queen. Now, if it had been a book that I liked, that it was very similar to, then I probably would have had more lenience with it. For example, I enjoyed Hunger Games. I liked that book. So I had less of a problem that it was similar to Hunger Games than I did that it was similar to Red Queen. But regardless, some things were just too similar on both sides, I think. But I feel like particularly it was more like Red Queen than it was Hunger Games. So it made me like this book less. Really, there's only one other problem that I can think of, but it did annoy me slightly, and that was the villainous characters. So they were really mediocre, honestly, and it was kind of just a sign of bad writing. Now, as an aspiring author myself, I understand how hard it is to write villains. It legitimately is very difficult. I understand that. I have so much problem with villains specifically. But as a reader, when I would see the villain characters or the mean ones talking to the main characters, I cringed. It was kind of bad. And not in a villain bad way, just in a, oh, bad way. Like the insults, like people insulting each other in high school. Immature and useless. Now, one was basically just a high school age teenager, and she was mean. So I expected that from her. I wish there had been more to her character. And she was the one that I felt was really similar to a character in Red Queen. Now, I actually liked this character in Red Queen after a while. She had some redeeming qualities. Even if they weren't good redeeming qualities, she had a good villain arc. And then I believe she even goes on to help eventually. But this one, I don't even remember her name, honestly. Probably remember it later. Blair, that's what it was. It was Blair. I remember that because one of the brother insults her with it. Anyway, so every time they were talking to Blair, part of me would shrivel inside just because how not only cliche it was, just kind of cheesy high school bully vibes. And that was okay because she kind of was just that. Even if it wasn't in that setting, that's just what her character was. So yeah, I can accept that. But then the main villain, it was ruined because it was almost the same thing. Like, no. The main villain is a completely different character, and he should not have been a high school bully type. My insides just hurt when he was talking to the protagonist. He just wasn't a well-written villain. Not at all. And I'll probably go into more details on specifically why and everything in the spoilers section, which is probably where I will move right now. So goodbye if you haven't read this book and don't want spoilers. Now, welcome to the spoiler section of this video. So first things first, I'm gonna kind of go through all of the major points that I liked and things I had problems with. So first, they meet. Kai has just gone through this whole thing with this family who are harboring an ordinary child, and he is sent there to execute the child because that's his job. He spares the child, which I wasn't sure if he would or not, honestly, but I thought that was a good thing. You know, we don't want a children killer. That would make him a real monster, and he says he's a monster a lot, but I didn't really see it. He kills 2 people tops, and one was a silencer who had tried to murder him and overthrow his kingdom by being in the rebellion, so not much sympathy there. And then the other one he had to because she was about to kill Peyton in the trials, so yeah. The silencer could have lived, really, but there wasn't much point keeping him alive, as Kai mentions. But other than that, I just didn't see a lot of callousness from him. Other than him killing those 2 people, and with one, he even buried her with flowers and everything, which was something Peyton specifically notes. So we see the softer side of his character, and that's all well and good. But I was really expecting more of an anti-hero from him, and to have a good arc. But there wasn't as much an arc for him. And not really for Peyton as much either. I had just been really excited to read this book thinking that's the dynamic I would get, and then kind of being disappointed when it wasn't. And I probably would have enjoyed it had there not been as much Red Queen vomit everywhere. Now, getting to some of the other things that specifically bothered me, like the scenes and stuff. The first thing is when they meet, I'm expecting him to find out what she is, and then have the actual, he's the hunter who's gonna kill her, and she's the ordinary who's gonna be running away, but fighting back. But no. Instead, they flirt, and she robs him. Then he nearly dies, and she saves him. Sure, that works. I mean, I didn't have that much of a problem with it. I was just expecting one thing and then got something else that would have been okay if there weren't certain other things. And the next thing was the trials. The trials themselves were okay, little Hunger Games-ish, and not what I had been expecting. I was really excited for the trials, but they ended up being kind of more mediocre than I was expecting. More trudge, something difficult and hard and makes me tired. Oh, other people have to kill them all. Some people die that I don't really care about. Oh, wow. So that was more how it was. But I had been expecting something else, which that was just a lot of this book. It had a simple summary, but I had a lot of expectations. It sounded good, and I just feel like it wasn't delivered. I just didn't really get what I wanted. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's a pleasant surprise. For this, I would have rather actually gotten what I wanted. Now again, Kai's and Peyton's relationship, pretty good. But a lot of their moments I feel like were ruined by Kit. Kit was a fine character himself. I thought he was, basic, cool, sure. He was nice, he was fine. Not much to say about him, honestly. Half the reason that Peyton doesn't like Kit in the beginning is just because of his eye color. And they remind her of the king. And I was just kind of like, come on, girl, like that's such an unfair judgment. But I also didn't want her to get closer to Kit in case it was another dumpster fire red queen love triangle. I was not touching that again. No. But thankfully it wasn't that bad. But Peyton's manipulation of him was just kind of rough. And honestly, one of my favorite parts was kind of his dark side twist at the very end in the epilogue. I wasn't expecting to like that part. His character suddenly got a heck of a lot more interesting, and so did the book at the very end, which I can say doesn't happen in a lot of books. Most endings are just the end, and some are not as fulfilling. Furthermore, with the end being more interesting was the big twist with how Kai was actually the killer of Peyton's father. I actually loved that about it because the whole freaking book, half of it is Peyton thinking about how the king killed her father and being angry about it. Now, she's angry about a lot of things, but she's really angry about this, and for good reason. Like, basically ruined her entire life, made her homeless. She was on the streets for years. She lost the one person she loved. She had a right to be darn angry about it. But the king was just such a pathetic villain that I wasn't having it. I wanted her to take him out immediately, not because he was the bad guy. Sometimes you kind of like the villains to last for a while, others you really don't. This was I really didn't want him to stick around because he should be replaced by a much better villain. Like when the king was talking to Peyton out in the hallway, she had been with Kit, and then the king came along and he was just talking to her, and I was just, oh, I hated it so much. That part was so hard to get through because it just wasn't the best written scene, and it was just so generic, and his threats just didn't come across like actually threatening, and as they should have. Especially the climax was supposed to be very big, and the fight scene we've all been waiting for. She has all of this pent-up rage at the king, and again, good reason, she's angry. She has so much right to be. But because the king was not a good villain and he was pathetic, the fight scene just didn't hit the same for me. I knew she was gonna straight up kill him really fast, and when he started like carving things over her heart, I was like, okay, yeah. So he's like a little bit of a threat, he's doing mean things, and then he just starts saying random stuff, and I'm like, but then he opened his mouth. But then there's the twist, and he reveals what he does about Kai, and I was just like, oh, wait, what? I'm actually surprised. And it finally finally sets up the perfect base for the next book. And we finally will actually get The Hunter and Hunted, which was supposed to be this book, but wasn't at all. But the first book was a great precedent for it because you have all of their history now. So now it's an even greater conflict. So I am much looking forward to the second book, and I hope it is significantly better than this one because it's actually the story I was planning on reading. Okay, there is one more thing. There is another thing that bothered me. This is probably the last one, but I definitely wanted to rant about this just a little bit. Peyton's power. Her psychic abilities. At first, I kind of really liked it. So she's an ordinary. Her father knew this and wanted to protect her, so he trains her to do this rare ability that, if trained enough, she would be able to fake it until she made it. And I thought that makes a lot of sense. It's smart. This is a con people can pull off. You can pretend to have psychic abilities if you're observant enough. And I liked seeing all of her putting things together and everything. But then she was right every single time. Like what? That's not statistically possible. She can't correctly assume everything just by looking at a person. Unless she actually is a psychic and she's not actually ordinary. That would be a fun twist. Make things more interesting. But I don't know if that's the route we're going to go. And if it isn't, I just feel like she should not have been able to correctly guess every single time. Like, she was listing off things she had guessed about random people in the stadium as her display for the trials, her presentation or whatever. And she listed things that I was just like, yeah. Like, girl, no matter how many details you look or how long you assess a person, you can ask questions, maybe that would help, but just by looking at a person, there's no way you can guess that kind of thing. She looks at one guy, he has some dust on his knee, and he looks happy, and she's like, oh, obviously you proposed to your girlfriend just today. Like, really? Good guess, right? But there just were things she should not have been able to guess. It just didn't make sense for her to be right every single time. It literally did not at all. It honestly would have been better to the story had she gotten some things wrong. That's what I had been hoping for, honestly, because good, healthy conflict is good. And this would have been a very interesting and basic and making sense to happen conflict, where she gets some things wrong, and then Kai or whoever else, the king, perhaps, who apparently knew she was ordinary all along, probably because he knew her father and he was just expecting her to be in league with the rebellion and lead him to them, which I suppose she technically did, but then she killed him. So, shame on him for just not taking her out while he still could. Or throwing her in the dungeon and having Kai torture. That would have solved a few problems, but no, he's just short-sighted. Anyway, back to Peyton's power. It would have been much more interesting, in my opinion, if she had gotten things wrong. Not only did it make sense logically that she would have gotten some things wrong, she wouldn't have been able to guess everything. It would have created good conflict for the story. It would have made things more interesting. That's just not the route the author decided to take, and that's okay. I'm not too bitter about this book, despite tearing it to pieces a little bit, but that's more my Red Queen rage, mostly. By itself, this book was still pretty good. There were some good moments. Those were just a lot of my main problems that I had with it, but overall, there were some good parts, and there were maybe a lot of parts that I didn't enjoy as much, but I am still really looking forward to the second one because that epilogue was pretty good. I liked Kit's kind of rage because he deserved it. I mean, Peyton was a backstabbing liar that he trusted and she totally, betrayed him. So he did deserve his anger also. It was a little, sudden, but I was okay with that. because finally I will get what I was actually hoping for when I wanted to read this book. So hopefully this author hears my plea and writes the second one a little better, maybe? So those are my thoughts on Powerless, and for now, I will see you later.